For 100 years now, one company has been a cornerstone of childhood, filling our playrooms with everything from plastic potatoes to transforming robots. But the story of Hasbro, it's more than just fun and games. It's actually a surprisingly complex tale of innovation, huge cultural shifts, and a fascinating and sometimes pretty startling connection to the real world. So, let's unpack it. It sounds like the setup to a really strange joke, right? But the answer, believe it or not, connects thousands of years of human history, and it reveals the totally unexpected journey of play. They're all, in their own way, part of the story we're about to get into. You see, before there were ever toy companies, there were toys. So to really understand a giant like Hasbro, we have to go back, way back, to the very beginning of play itself. Back when the first toys weren't sold in stores, but were shaped by hand from the world around us. And what's so fascinating is that from the very, very beginning, toys have pretty much been miniature versions of the adult world. In the Indus Valley, kids played with these tiny wheeled carts, kind of learning about the transportation that powered their society. In Mesopotamia, it was miniature chariots. These weren't just for fun. They were actually tools for learning about the world and, preparing for what you'd be doing as a grown-up. For literally thousands of years, toys were unique, handcrafted items, a total one-of-a-kind thing. But then, the Industrial Revolution happened, and suddenly all these new manufacturing technologies meant toys could be churned out in factories, quickly and cheaply. This was the moment that play began its transformation from this, domestic craft into a massive commercial industry. And all this new industrial power, well, it gave birth to the American toy industry. Before the 20th century, most toys were actually imported from Europe. But the creation of the New York Toy Fair in 1903, that signaled a huge change. A domestic industry was forming, one that would eventually become the largest in the world. And it set the perfect stage for a small family business in Rhode Island. And that, right there, brings us to the Hassenfeld brothers. We're zeroing in on 3 Polish-Jewish immigrants who started a company that would one day be known as Hasbro. But believe me, their journey did not start with toys. They started out in 1923 by selling textile remnants. We're talking scraps of cloth. From there, they pivoted to school supplies, things like pencil boxes. It wasn't until the 1940s that they kind of dipped their toes into the toy business with doctor and nurse kits. So it was a slow, practical evolution, but one really quirky invention was about to change absolutely everything. In 1952, the Hassenfeld brothers bought an idea from an inventor named George Lerner, a set of plastic face parts that kids could stick into a real potato. They called it Mr. Potato Head, but their real genius wasn't just in buying the toy, it was in how they sold it. By advertising it on that new, magical box in everyone's living room, the television, they created a national phenomenon. Mr. Potato Head didn't just build Hasbro, it pioneered an entirely new era of marketing. So, with the success of Mr. Potato Head, Hasbro had some serious momentum. Its next big move wouldn't just create an icon, it would invent an entire category of toy that still dominates the market today. This, my friends, was the era of G.I. Joe. Okay, so in 1964, Hasbro wanted to sell this posable military man to boys. But there was a problem. Boys didn't play with dolls. So Hasbro's marketing team just invented a new name. They called it an action figure. And with that one simple linguistic trick, they completely sidestepped a cultural taboo and opened up a massive new market. It was an absolutely brilliant piece of branding. But tying a toy to the military, that comes with risks. As the Vietnam War grew more and more unpopular, well, so did military toys, and G.I. Joe's sales just plummeted. In response, Hasbro rebranded him from a soldier into a member of the adventure team. It was an early and pretty tough lesson in how real-world politics can directly impact the playroom. Now, while action figures were a success, Hasbro's path to becoming a true empire was paved with acquisitions. In 1984, they bought Milton Bradley, home of classics like The Game of Life. Then, in 1991, a massive move. They acquired Tonka. This deal didn't just give them its famous trucks. It also gave them Parker Brothers, and with it, the crown jewel of board games, Monopoly. With just a few key purchases, Hasbro had become the largest board game producer in the entire world. And it's right here that our story takes a really interesting turn. We've seen how toys reflect culture, but what happens when the line between a child's plaything and the actual machinery of conflict starts to blur? You might remember the Robin Williams movie Toys. It was about this whimsical toy factory being taken over by a general to build miniature war machines. Well, what's fascinating is that this wasn't pure fantasy. The director was actually inspired by a real news story. Soviet intelligence was learning classified details about US submarines just by studying highly accurate toy models that were sold in stores. The line was already blurring. This brings us to a concept that was documented way back in the 1970s called remote warfare. The idea is simple but pretty profound. You separate the soldier from the vehicle. An operator sits at a safe, distant location, controlling a plane or a tank just by watching a screen, creating the sensory illusion of being there but without any of the physical risk. And here is where the connection becomes just startlingly direct. According to research from that time, these early drones, or remotely piloted vehicles, were often so simple and inexpensive that the US Air Force actually asked for production bids from toy manufacturers. Yeah, the skills used to make a model airplane were suddenly relevant to building the next generation of military hardware. A writer at the time summed up the ethical implications of this new warfare with this one chilling line. When combat is so detached, when the risk is completely removed for one side, the very nature of conflict changes. War becomes, in a sense, a game where only one side can truly lose. This connection, it really forces us to ask a difficult question. If the technology of play and the technology of warfare are converging like this, what does that mean for the innocence that we all associate with our toys? It's a heavy thought, for sure, and one that brings us to the challenges Hasbro is facing today. So, after a century, Hasbro is navigating its most dramatic transformation yet. The challenges are no longer just about cultural shifts. They're about massive financial and technological pressures that are forcing the company to completely redefine itself. And this number, this represents the human cost of that transformation. In December of 2023, Hasbro laid off 1,100 employees. That's nearly 20% of its global workforce. It was a crystal clear signal that the company was in the middle of a radical and really painful restructuring. A key part of that restructuring was unwinding a massive bet on Hollywood. Back in 2019, Hasbro spent $4 billion to buy Entertainment One, the studio behind Peppa Pig. Just 4 years later, they sold it for only $500 million, a catastrophic loss. The goal was to shed all the distractions and focus only on what was making the most money. So what is making the most money? Well, the answer might surprise you. As you can see from their revenue breakdown, Hasbro's most profitable and fastest-growing division isn't G.I. Joe or Monopoly. It's Wizards of the Coast and digital gaming. This segment, which includes Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering, now makes more money than the company's entire traditional toy business. In fact, the digital gaming division has become so valuable that an activist investor recently launched a campaign to force Hasbro to spin it off as a completely separate company. They argued that the toy business was holding back the much more profitable gaming business. Now, Hasbro won that fight, but it highlighted a real identity crisis. Is Hasbro still a toy company, or is it now a gaming company that just has a toy division? So after 100 years, the journey of play has led us here. From handmade clay carts, to the first TV toy, to action figures that mirrored real-world conflicts, and now to a future dominated by digital worlds. It leaves us with one final thought. As play becomes more complex, more digital, and more commercialized, is there still room for the world's oldest and simplest toy? The stick.